The phone buzzed at 6:02 a.m., the sound too insistent to be anything but trouble. My thumb found Preston's name before my coffee did. "Dana," he said, clipped as a blade. "We need to talk, now. HR is in on it. You're being let go. Unprofessional behavior. We can't have people who are disruptive. Richard agrees." He used the corporate euphemism like a talisman. Unprofessional, difficult to manage, too senior to be coached. Unprofessional meant whatever they needed it to mean that morning. The blinds were still closed in my apartment. The city outside was a gray smear. I listened to Preston flapping his script across the line, and while his words rattled around my head, something colder took over. Timing. They'd fired me to make it clean. They wanted an exit that looked tidy on paper, a line item you could show investors. We cleaned house. What they hadn't accounted for was the gap between the ceremonial firing and the actual extinguishing of access. There is always a window. Companies automate a lot of the unpleasant bits, but those systems don't flip off like a light bulb the instant someone says the words, "You're terminated." There's a lag. The servers, the calendar feeds, the human habits that hold value in an organization, those are slower. And in those slownesses live possibilities. I didn't panic. Panic is for people who think the world ends when a title is removed. I sat up, ran a hand over my face, and felt, with a precision only years of being the person everyone calls at 2 a.m. can give you, the shape of the next 3 hours. "Why now?" I asked. Not because I wanted him to justify it. I'd heard the private team chatter 4 months ago, the way the new VP's name kept surfacing in Richard's half-empty praise, but because I needed to hold him to his timing. Preston sighed, the sound of a man expecting applause for stepping on someone. "We have to move fast. Please hand over your accounts to Chloe. We'll cut your access by 8. HR will follow up." Chloe. My heart did an involuntary stutter. She was smart and new and had been my analyst for 9 months, the kind who arrives early and leaves late because she believes in learning something the way other people collect shoes. She did not deserve to be collateral, and one of the rules I live by is you do not leave good people in a burning room. I said nothing about Chloe to Preston. He would have used it to say more cruel things. But he had set a time, 8 o'clock. A timetable is a gift if you know how to use it. I fixed myself a coffee. The grinder rattled like a small percussion section. The apartment smelled like someone who had an odd relationship with beans and strategy. I pulled my laptop forward. My fingers hovered over the trackpad, and instead of dialing a faceless IT emergency line, I began the business of rearranging expectations. Let me be very clear here. I did not hack the system, I did not delete files or siphon confidential folders into a folder labeled Revenge. Those are myths and they're crimes. What I did was use the tools everyone in the company used every day: email, calendars, relationships, and the one asset you can't automate: trust. Trust is messy and human. A dashboard will show that a meeting exists. It won't show the reason people show up. A CRM will list a contact as owned by Dana, but when I leave, an investor doesn't immediately transfer their confidence to an org chart. They transfer to the person who shows up with answers, who remembers a comment from 2 summers ago, who calls and says, "I'm here." I opened the calendar to a set of invites that, at first glance, looked like noise. A Q3 review, a partner check-in, and a client-facing strategy session. Noise is valuable if you know where to strike. The Q3 review, scheduled for 10 o'clock, was the beating heart of Preston's new narrative. He wanted it to be his moment, the platform where he could recite the sanitized numbers and the clever slide about realignment. If he had an audience of internal stakeholders and a handful of client representatives, the optics would look clean. Suddenly, the firing would read as a restructuring, the kind of thing that boards present as decisive and necessary. So I made choices. I silenced the organizer who had a habit of blasting out invites across time zones. I adjusted visibility in a way that left the invite alive, but made it seem like a system glitch. Nobody broadcasts a missing meeting. They simply assume the organizer had technical issues or rescheduled. I nudged a few non-critical invites into private time slots so the people who most mattered to that meeting wouldn't see an actionable calendar notification. There was no deletion, no assault on data integrity, only the careful, surgical redirection of attention. Actions like that are theater if you want them to be, but they are more often just practical. If the wrong people are absent from a stage, the speech loses its power. Preston relied on optics. He didn't understand the scaffolding. I did. At 6:37 a.m., I texted Chloe to ask for a file she had prepared 2 nights earlier. She answered immediately, sleepy and dutiful. Her messages were careful, the way someone who wants to keep their head down is careful. I told her to hold until I could call. I didn't tell her about the firing. I asked about a footnote in a deck and whether she'd commented on a risk exposure. She sent me the file and a brief note asking if I was okay. The guilt of leaving someone behind sat like a stone in my stomach, but I had to convert risk into leverage for more than myself. Chloe's career was worth protecting. By 7 a.m., Preston had already started sending directionals to HR. Lock her keys, remove her badges. Those are words that sound decisive until you realize the bureaucracy required to make them stick. I watched my inbox for the automated message that would say, "Access revoked." It didn't come. The clock was my ally. I called a former colleague, someone I had not spoken to in a professional capacity for almost a year, Marcus Thorne. Marcus had left Optima 2 years earlier to join Apex, a competitor that liked its edges sharpened and its message bold. Marcus and I had been friendly rivals. We knew each other's strengths and, more importantly, each other's contacts. He answered on the 3rd ring. The call was a test. Would he pick up, and if so, would he pick up with the kind of focus I needed? "Marcus," I said, not wasting breath, "I'm not calling to talk about the weather." "You're not one of those," he said. His voice was a low cut of amusement that hid an assessment. "What's up?" I told him, in measured phrases, a firing, the language they used, my access window. I did not narrate the calendar moves. I don't broadcast the steps I take, but I told him enough, that the company had made a public misstep with talent and that there was fallout to be managed. Marcus listened. If there's one thing I learned in years of client management, it's to pitch the right level of urgency. Too little and you get platitudes, too much and you become a headline. Within an hour, Marcus had arranged an internal discussion with his CEO. Apex had been watching Optima for months, noting the cracks in their leadership veneer. Marcus's call was opportunistic, but not predatory. He framed it as continuity for clients, protection for talent, and a chance for Apex to step in where Optima's showmanship failed. He used words like trusted partner and reputational risk, the vocabulary of people who move capital with a smile and then pull it away without drama. By 9:30 a.m., there was an offer on the table, raw, conditional, but attractive, a senior role tailored to client relations, a team, budget, and the explicit backing to make immediate contact with clients. It was the kind of offer that translates into momentum. I didn't sign on the spot. I counted my costs and my ethics, then allowed myself a private, small smile. Turning an exit into an entrance is a skill. It felt like puppetry until the puppets were real people smiling at you for employment. Before I accepted, I did something that made my stomach twist. I drafted a LinkedIn post. Not a meltdown or finger-wagging manifesto, nothing performative, simply a statement of availability, dignity, and continuity, a sentence that said, in a way investors understand, "I'm open for partnership where clients' interests come first." I hit publish and watched the little machine of social reputation start to hum. There was a particular satisfaction in watching endorsements come in from people who had worked with me for years, small human votes that matter because they are real. If you're watching this and like stories where the person who deserves better gets it, subscribe. I tell them when they deserve it. My inbox began to vibrate. DMs, a few alarmed messages from friends, and a subject line I had wanted to see for a long time: Arthur Sterling. Arthur was the kind of investor people whisper about in captive boardrooms. Whale capital, old money, the sort of man who preferred deal rooms to Twitter storms. He wasn't flashy, he called things as he saw them. His funds had a disproportionate influence on mid-market software companies. Sterling didn't like surprises. Sterling liked certainty. If you could convince him of continuity, he would move mountains. If you didn't, he could also make those mountains look like molehills by pulling commitments. I wrote him a short, unadorned email. No dramatics, no plea. A lunch? 2 lines about continuity and the risks I had seen. He replied quickly with a single sentence: "Let's talk." There are moments where the world collapses into a single hinge. For me, that hinge was the knowledge that capital follows confidence. You don't take money because you have a deck. You take money because someone with the capacity to allocate it believes they're buying stability, when in reality, they're buying a person who can make the mess tolerable. That is claimable capital. Preston did not yet perceive the claim. He was busy performing the optics he thought he needed, sending a press-ready memo to internal leaders and rehearsing a line about decisive action with Richard, who seemed to prefer speeches to listening. I imagined Richard pacing in a glass office somewhere downtown, gestures precise, saying things like, "We are committed to excellence," and "This is about culture." He was the kind of CEO who had risen through a blend of charisma and old money tolerances. He had never been good with the sloppy human stuff: loyalty, relationships, the messy pieces that actually make a company function. He could throw a good town hall, he couldn't hold a relationship when it mattered. By mid-morning, Optima's pulse began to fluctuate. I started receiving calls from 2 categories of people: those who wanted to protect themselves and those who wanted to understand what my departure meant for them. The latter were the investors and a handful of clients who had built relationships with me because I returned calls and remembered details, like a CEO mentioning his daughter's favorite charity in passing. Those details build trust. They are the currency you can't code. I handled those calls with the care of someone dealing with fragile glass. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. I didn't gloat. You gain more by being the adult in the room than by dancing on a rooftop. I told them I was available to ensure continuity, that I cared about the work we had started, and that their teams would be prioritized. A few people said, "We need to talk to the board," but most asked the practical question, "Will you keep working with us?" I answered as honestly as I could, "Yes, if it makes sense for your business." Word of my availability traveled faster than the press release that scheduled my termination. That, oddly, is the actual magic of modern corporate life. Public announcements run on a script. People on the inside make decisions in private. Optima noticed small tremors. A CFO in a partner firm asked their team whether Optima's vendor manager had changed. A procurement lead at a major client pinged legal to double-check contract terms. Small flutters of uncertainty accumulate quickly in the world of capital. Preston responded like a man who had but one weapon: narrative control. He issued statements, set a tone, and tried to put a clean face on what was, internally, a ragged cut. But narrative is fragile in the face of missing signatures and trembling staff. At 11:15 a.m., I got an email from HR at Optima, Gerald, the general counsel, asking for an exit interview and to ensure proper transition of client materials. It was polite and bureaucratic. I read it and forwarded it to Marcus and to Sarah, the counsel I would now be working with at Apex. I wanted someone else to see their tone before I had to see it too many times. Sarah's reply was brisk. Keep all communications. Forward us everything. We'll handle their theatrics. Legal theater arrived promptly. 2 hours later, I received a notice from Optima's counsel, sterile and thick with the kind of language that makes people feel crowded. Non-compete clauses, reminders of fiduciary duties, threats thinly veiled as protecting proprietary information. The message was clear. Don't move clients, don't solicit, lock up your talents in unreadable legalese. I forwarded the letter to Sarah with a single line. They'll try the playbook. What's the posture? She answered with a professional calm that could peel varnish. We need to see their documents. Non-compete enforcement is only as strong as signed and executed agreements. If HR lacks the proper executed forms, there's leverage. Also, their threats are aggressive. Expect posturing. A note here that I want to make explicit. Legal outcomes vary wildly. The particular jurisdiction where Optima is incorporated can shape non-compete enforceability. Counsel matters more than slogans. This isn't a how-to, this is prosaic reality. Where paperwork is missing, the threats are weaker. Where counsel is sharp, threats can bite. I am not endorsing legal games, I am reporting facts as they unfolded in this specific, messy situation. Meanwhile, the human consequences showed up. Chloe texted me at noon. They're moving everything to Randy from HR, I'm scared. I called her. She answered with a voice that had the thin shell of professionalism and a tremor underneath. I told her 2 things. First, I would try to protect her role where I could. Second, that she should make a clean copy of her work and keep a record of what she had been instructed to do. Not because I wanted to provide instruction on how to leave, again, this is not advice, but because records matter in disputes. People who live on attention notice the absence of it when it goes missing. Chloe's fear was a moral brushstroke across the picture I was painting. I'm not a monster. My plan wasn't to watch a company burn and dance on the ashes. My plan was to secure continuity for the work that mattered, and to prevent hurt when possible. Some people would lose their jobs. That was the reality of corporate shifts. I promised Chloe I would try, and privately I resolved to hire her if things tipped my way. Empathy isn't a weakness, it's a strategy for building teams that last. By early afternoon, the pinging from my inbox intensified. A recruiter from a Big Four firm called asking to debrief professionally. A head of operations at a client firm asked if I'd be introducing them to someone at Apex. Small fires, each manageable on their own, began to form a pattern. The market was interested in the person more than the org chart. That is capital moving in a certain humanized sense. Investors, like people, hold attachments to individuals. You can lose a job title, you can't necessarily unring the bell of earned confidence. I met Marcus briefly in a windowless conference room at a neutral cafe, civility over espresso. He gave me the logistics, budget, team, autonomy. He did not oversell. Instead, he offered stability, something that sounded almost dull and yet at that moment felt like armor. Do you want it? He asked. I knew what the role would imply. I knew the gossip that would come with it. Moving to a rival the day you were fired looks like retaliation. It looks messy, it looks dramatic. That part was fine. What mattered was the work and the capital behind it. If Arthur Sterling or other interested parties wanted to follow me to Apex because they believed in continuity, the move would not look like revenge, it would look like a better allocation of trust. I took the role, not because I wanted to posture, I took it to preserve clients and to give Chloe and others a landing place if I could make it happen. I signed the offer with a hand that didn't tremble. I kept my LinkedIn post measured. I told my new team that I was moving with intent. I did not gloat. There's a thin line between rightful vindication and gratuitous cruelty. Crossing it soothes no one. After I accepted, I sent Arthur a short, direct email requesting lunch, just the 2 of us. He replied in the affirmative with a time that was both impatient and eager. Old money likes immediacy. Money that moves at scale wants to feel in control of the narrative. He liked people who could deliver it. As the afternoon shadows shortened across the city, Optima's first public tremors came into view. A client manager from a large institutional partner called to say they had received a confusing memo about leadership transitions and asked for reassurance. A procurement lead at another client hinted at a review of vendor alignment. These were not yet catastrophic. They were, however, dangerous if ignored. I had access to the human side of this network. A rumor can kill a contract faster than a poor quarter can. I started making carefully worded calls, no grandstanding, only the sort of plain assurances people need when their work depends on stability. "We're arranging coverage," I told them. "I'll help if you want." There is an ethical gravity to those conversations. You cannot promise what you do not control. You can, however, show that you will be responsible. That earns trust, and trust is capital as surely as currency. Arthur, Marcus, Chloe, these were nodes in the web. At 5:20 p.m., I got a terse email from Gerald at Optima. "We are aware of potential solicitation. Cease and desist notices will be prepared if necessary." The legal threat was not new. Most companies keep the move of legal muscle as a late resort. The legal team was signaling that they were prepared to use the old tools: threaten litigation, invoke non-compete clauses, lean on the uncertainty those threats create. It costs time and money. It is also noise. I forwarded Gerald's note to Sarah and asked simply, "Are they bluffing?" Sarah replied, "We need to see anything they claim to have. If HR can't produce executed non-competes, their leverage is limited. Also, be mindful, they can hurt you by making your life difficult. That is why we will respond and not react." Her tone was a balm. Having counsel who speaks plainly is like having a map in a foreign land. It doesn't remove the risk, but it clarifies the terrain. There is a subtle power dynamic in how companies use legal threats. They are not always about law. Sometimes they're about creating friction, drawing out decisions, making the obvious choice costly by time. Richard's leadership style favored statements over nuance. He'd trained a team to react. But I had history with the people who held the relationships lifetime decisions are made upon. Arthur was one of them. That evening, I prepped for lunch with Sterling. Preparation for an investor meeting isn't about lying or flattery. It's about understanding the leverage you have and the leverage you don't. I wrote a short memo, 3 pages, on continuity and risk exposure. I emphasized people, not slides. I highlighted the cost of losing relationships, client churn, vendor confusion, internal morale. Numbers mattered, but the story of human continuity mattered more to people like Arthur. He didn't buy hype, he bought structured assurance. Before I left for the restaurant, Chloe sent a voice note. "If things go sideways, please let me know. I don't want to be stuck." Her voice was small in a way it had never been before. I promised her nothing more than I could deliver. I resolved then and there that if capital followed me, and if I could bring people with me, I would. The elevator taking me down was glass. The city at dusk spread itself like a brochure outside. I thought about how corporate power often resembles a fragile set of stacked plates: showmanship at the top, brittle loyalties in the middle, and actual work down below. Remove one support and gravity does the rest. I didn't set out to be a wrecking ball. I set out to be a bridge. When Arthur arrived, he was smaller than I expected in person, older, precise, with an old-school watch that matched his hands. He ordered no wine, only water. The lunch was brief and to the point. He asked 3 questions. Why you? Why now? Who loses? Why me, I said, because I deliver when it matters, because I've been on the files, because people trust me to sort their priorities. Why now? Because the leadership pair failed the easy test. They chose optics over continuity. And who loses? The people who don't have someone to stand up for them, support staff, junior analysts, the teams that do the real work. He stared at me for a long beat, assessing whether my clarity was bravado or evidence. Then he said something only investors say when they feel a certain kind of certainty. Bring me a plan. If it makes sense, we'll move. It was not a bank wire. It was not a promise. It was instead the key word I've learned to listen for: move. Investors speak in verbs. Move means consider, allocate, reassign trust. It does not mean overnight miracles. It means conditional capital. That night, I lay awake thinking of the geometry of it all. I had been called unprofessional because I asked questions, because I insisted on doing the messy work others outsourced. They had intended to make an example of me. What they had not counted on was the social capital I had accumulated, a network of people who would rather follow competence than a charming speaker at a podium. There is a fine moral line here. I am not telling you to use people. I am telling you what happened when someone tried to use me. I converted trust into leverage. I did not steal it. I asked for loyalty, offered stability, and in return I received the possibility of capital. By the time the city lights turned on and my phone thrummed with more messages, I had done several things that, in quiet, would later prove consequential. I had accepted an offer with a rival. I had made preliminary contact with a whale investor. I had ensured Chloe had a safety net by promising to advocate for her, and I had left enough of Optima's structure intact to avoid obvious legal condemnation. The door was ajar, not burned. But this was only the opening set. The real test, how much of Optima's trust would actually follow me, how the board would react, and whether Richard could hold a room of investors together, had not yet played out. The morning's window had given me a rhythm for the day, but the market moves are not a single-day thing. They are a negotiation between reputation, paperwork, and pockets deep enough to care. Before I could close my laptop that night, another message blinked into life. An internal note leaked to me through a former partner. Preston was planning a big Q3 presentation, very public, very scripted. He planned to use Optima's public channels to show decisiveness. They would schedule the earnings call for the week ahead. If he controlled the stage on that call, he could claim competence and perhaps beat back the narratives. And if he managed to hold the room, the small moves I had made early might look like nothing. That was the moment I smiled in a way I hadn't allowed myself all day. It isn't that I am vengeful by nature, it's that corporate theater relies on audiences showing up. Remove the audience and the play collapses. I'd not yet decided whether to take down a stage. I had decided to stake my claim on something more durable, capital that believes in people over performative leadership. The next morning, as dawn edged into the skyline, I opened my inbox and found something awkwardly theatrical. A short note from Richard himself, requested for a 10 a.m. chat. The chairman wanted to clarify the leadership narrative. He wanted to control the story before it unfurled. He was, in his way, panicking. I put on a jacket that felt like armor, not because I wanted to be combative, but because the day demanded formality. I texted Chloe, "Keep your phone on." I texted Marcus, "If they come for you, tell them no comment." And I dialed Arthur to confirm the lunch. At 9:54 a.m., as the elevator doors closed and the city became a blur of moving pieces, I felt the peculiar clarity of someone who had been offered a label, unprofessional, and decided to own the true meaning of that word, professional enough to know when to leave, and professional enough to make sure the work continued. And then the line on my phone flashed with an incoming number I did not recognize. The subject line in my email at the same moment read, "Urgent, board inquiry, re-client continuity." Optima had noticed the tremors. The pieces were in motion. The rest would be about how far those ripples would reach, into investor accounts, into boardrooms, into a public earnings call where Richard could either steady the ship or fall apart. I closed the folder on my laptop and stepped into the light. The game, if you like that phrasing, had only just begun. The elevator dinged me back into the street like a stage crew lowering a curtain. Outside, the city kept its indifferent rhythm. Delivery trucks, a dog walker with an umbrella, the glass towers humming. My phone was a small, furious drumbeat in my hand. Board inquiry, earnings call scheduled, investors asking quiet, dangerous questions. It was one thing to set a plan, it was another to watch it meet pressure in public. I went straight to the Apex office. On the subway, I watched people who had no idea their daily lives were an economy in motion, cafes, suits, earbuds, while mine rearranged overnight. It never stops being odd how many lives are held together by the quiet competence you get up and do. That idea had a moral weight to it. I wanted to hold it, not as vengeance, but as stewardship. Marcus met me in the lobby like a general greeting an ally. His smile was the kind that said, "We have weathered storms before," and his handshake was a contract without paperwork. "You look like someone who just won a small war," he said. "Let's not get dramatic," I told him. "We have to be surgical." He led me up to the glass-walled conference room where my new desk would be, the skyline folding itself into our reflection. There were new badges to pick up, a seat to claim. We exchanged the perfunctory niceties, job title, budget, scope, all the small formalities that let an organization believe it's stable. I signed, stamped, and didn't celebrate. There was work to do, and revenge is too thin a fuel for long-term leadership. Back at my desk, Sarah, Apex Counsel, sat with me across a cluster of tablets and a paper-strewn coffee table. She is the kind of lawyer who wears pragmatism as armor. When she speaks, complicated things look like chess moves, not spells. "They're aggressive," she said, tapping her pen on the folder Gerald's note had been forwarded in. "Standard posture, but here's the thing. We can answer without escalating. We don't have to make headlines. We need to neutralize the threat and preserve momentum." "Which means?" I asked. "Means we respond with facts, demand proof of signed non-competes, request that any allegations of solicitation be specified, and critically, we tell the board and investors you're acting as a continuity professional. You're facilitating clients' transitions when it's in their interest. We keep things client first." Her plan was professional and boring in the best way. It relied on time, process, and the sort of patience that grinds away at theatrical threats. Also, she added, if they make a public legal move, it will draw more attention to their instability. Sometimes silence and a calm response are the loudest statements. I liked that. I liked that a measured counterpunch could be more devastating than a roar. People mistake noise for power. Noise is often the sign of desperation. Sarah's team opened a quiet channel with Gerald. The correspondence was professional, almost obligingly dull. Requests for documentation, confirmations of dates, signature pages. Gerald, in his office, wrote back in a tone designed to scrawl authority. Their contracts were binding, their clauses enforceable. The company would protect its interests. He implied action. He wanted me to feel the heat. I felt it in the way the morning inbox escalated. The head of operations at a major institutional partner, an organization with a reputation for meticulous governance, asked for clarity on continuity and whether their contacts would receive new points of contact. Procurement pinged legal. These are the moves that don't make headlines but determine cash flows. Small notes. Quiet priorities. I called the procurement head directly. I didn't make promises. I made commitments I intended to keep. Introductions, a named point of contact at Apex, a timeline for how clients would be supported. That earned me breathing room. At noon, the world made its first real, audible crack. Arthur Sterling called me from his office in an old stone building where the echo is part of the aesthetic. He sounded impatient and curious. "What you pitched," he said, "wasn't a personality, it was a containment strategy. Show me the plan." I sent him the memo I'd been drafting, the 3 pages about continuity, prioritized personnel, and minimal disruption. I didn't include anything proprietary that would invite claims of theft. I included my approach to client handoffs, the names of people I trusted, and a blunt assessment of what would happen if Optima kept its present posture. The language was utilitarian. Investors like that. It doesn't flatter, it contracts. There was a pause on his end that felt like a weighing. Then, I can greenlight a tranche for support, conditional, staged. $80 million doesn't mobilize on a handshake, but I can start the process. If your plan holds and we get positive signals, we'll move capital. That's the phrase again, move capital. It is both a risk and a tool. When someone like Arthur chooses to move his money, the world follows. When he chooses not to, you never fully recover. He was not promising salvation. He was offering conditional faith. I accepted the terms he set. Stage payments based on client retention metrics and independent audits. Fair, measured, impossible to dramatize into a soundbite. Perfect for execution. I told Marcus and Sarah what I'd negotiated. Marcus bristled. He's a man who likes to win theater as much as leverage, but even he could see the arithmetic. A named investor, willingness to allocate, and a visible plan meant the panic button on Optima's chest would be harder to press. At 3 p.m., Optima made a move that, in retrospect, was their best play and also their worst. Richard called for a hastily convened management briefing. He wanted to clarify the narrative. The board wanted reassurances. The VP of IR prepared talking points. The plan was to show confidence, to reassure investors that the firing was part of a strategy, not a panic. Preston, eager and rehearsed, would lead. He had slides and a new haircut and the kind of polish that screams, "Read the teleprompter." I knew their script, because people who have worked at the center of things learn the cadence of spin. Stage directions matter, and if the stage is empty, even the best script reads like a tragedy. Here's the thing about rehearsed confidence. It dies when the audience isn't there. At 3:45 p.m., I leaned back in my chair and watched a live feed of a calendar. Small acts. A procurement lead didn't accept the calendar invite. A partner representative had been uninvited by a mistaken visibility setting and didn't get the call alert. A general counsel at a large client had another meeting and couldn't be moved. These were not my doing in terms of criminality. They were the cascade of earlier choices, the soft gray work of nudging attention. The room Preston relied on thinned. That afternoon, a client relationship manager at a major institutional partner, call them Beacon Trust, made a quiet call to their board and suggested a vendor review. Beacon's counsel asked for contracts to be reviewed and payments to be held pending clarification. That triggered a chain reaction. The treasury team at a mid-sized asset manager asked an internal question, and a compliance officer at a large plan sponsor put a hold on a scheduled transaction. It felt bureaucratic, it felt slow, but it's in the slowness that consequences concentrate. News moved in strange ways. A blog from an industry analyst noted leadership turbulence at Optima. A financial newsletter flagged unusual chatter about account transitions. None of these were life-shattering by themselves. They were tags on a thread that tightened when pressure was applied. At 5 p.m., I got a text from Arthur. "We should prepare for a public call. Are you willing to be seen as a resource during the earnings call? If we can show continuity and client support, the market will hear it." He understood optics. He knew how to use them without spectacle. "Yes," I replied, "but let's do it professionally." We didn't speak publicly from the stage. I had no desire to be a show, that wasn't the point. But I agreed that Apex would have presence in the margins. Calls to key investors who would attend the earnings call, quiet notes to custodians, and readiness to receive any inbound questions about client continuity. It was a chess move, presence without theatrics. The next morning, the market moved. Market watchers noticed Optima's pre-market activity and the unusual pattern of investor inquiries. The trading desks busied themselves with rumor. The thing about markets is that they are as much about sentiment as spreadsheets. A doubt in a chair can bleed into prices. Earnings day dawned with the kind of tension that makes small gestures feel monumental. I watched the conference call from a glass room at Apex, a half-vaulted space that felt like a theater. Marcus sat beside me, fingers interlaced, scanning a tablet. Arthur dialed in from the corner of his downtown suite, voice calm and steady. On the Optima side, Richard led the call. He read the prepared script with the kind of visible conviction that had served him for years. His cadence was practiced. Preston provided the operational color. Both expected to ride the waves they'd prepared. Investors, however, had other ideas. The first question came from a quiet-sounding bond manager who simply asked, "Can you explain client retention plans in light of recent departures? Specifically, what contingency plans are in place for large accounts?" It was clinical. The tone in Richard's answers was smooth at first, then less steady. Then Arthur, blunt and to the point, asked whether they had received or would be receiving any significant capital movement inquiries, whether any of their major partners had delayed payments or requested reviews. He had the authority to ask. Richard pivoted, attempted reassurance, and cited standard procedures. His answers began to feel scripted, and the room on the Optima side tightened. Then one of my clients, someone I had courted for years, asked directly on the call whether we'd be able to maintain advisory continuity. That was the fracture. The voice on the call had the slight edge of someone who had decided not to be swept up in PR. Richard's reply was defensive. He suggested the company had full control. He promised aggressive measures to ensure continuity. Aggressive measures are different from competence. Aggression reads well in town halls. Competence reads well in the quiet, repetitive work of callers, reconciliations, and follow-ups. The investors asked for clarity on a particular outflow they had noticed in filings, an amount that matched Arthur's earlier conditional phrase. Someone on the call referenced a scheduled transfer flagged in a private report. An uncomfortable silence followed. Preston, under the light, began to sweat. His answers were quick and rhetorical. He had slides with big numbers and small type, but investors don't buy slide decks when cash is pedal to the floor real. They buy named relationships and reliable execution. When a client called and asked for a named contact and a plan, the company's script wasn't enough. The market is merciless about these moments. Within hours, trade desks began adjusting positions. The stock slipped. Press picked up the tone of uncertainty. Social feeds noted the disconnect between internal communications and client confidence. The narrative that had been rehearsed, "This was a decisive house cleaning," began to fray at the edges. Preston's public composure cracked mid-question. He tried to put on a brave face and accuse those asking of meddling. Tone mismatches are fatal in public calls. Richard, who had always relied on charm to paper over cracks, failed to steady him. Public confidence is a compound interest account. It compounds trust when steady and shrinks fast when doubt appears. I watched it unfold and felt neither glee nor hatred. It was a phenomenon, a natural consequence of decisions. There was a professional satisfaction, yes, the same kind you get from seeing a plan play out as intended, but I also thought of Chloe and the analysts who would be left in limbo if the company collapsed.
There is no moral purity in breaking an organization. Salvage is the only ethical path I see in these scenarios. Optima's legal posture escalated. Gerald, perhaps sensing the board's panic, sent formal letters threatening litigation if we solicited clients. They filed an emergency motion in a local court seeking a temporary restraining order. The request was dramatic, an old company's theatrical weapon. The timing, however, was clumsy. Filings were public, and the motion exposed gaps, missing executed agreements, curiously uncollected signatures. Sarah pounced on the omission like a surgeon. If Optima couldn't produce executed non-compete agreements, the court would be less inclined to freeze movement. In simple terms, paperwork matters. The motion made headlines. The press wrote about legal standoffs and leadership crises. Brokers made notes. The public legal filing allowed Sarah and Gerald's correspondence to be visible to a judge, and Gerald's letter, so rich in menace, now had to stand up to judicial scrutiny. It is an uncomfortable thing to threaten litigation without being prepared to show the documentation that supports it. I do not pretend the law is always a fair place. It is messy and contingent. But the motion's publication created a paradox for Optima. To win, they'd have to reveal the very documents they had hoped to keep opaque. The board had painted with a broad brush when it fired me. Now that brushstroke had to contend with the fine print. Investors like clarity, and courts like contracts. A public legal fight invites discovery. Discovery invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites doubt. Arthur, who had been quiet through much of the turmoil, asked for a heads-up on the filings and the status of client signals. He told me to hold on to any inbound notices and to keep channels open. That evening, I had a call with him that was almost ritual in its bluntness. If we take any tranche, he said, it must be conditioned on demonstrating client continuity and minimizing legal exposure. Also, bring me the list of people you propose we hire from Optima, with a plan to onboard them at Apex. We want to avoid public accusations of poaching and keep this pragmatic. There was a moral precision to what Arthur wanted, a practical rescue, not a spectacle. He wanted to move money to preserve value, not to relish in a company's pain. That distinction mattered to me. That was the line I tried to walk. Ruthless for systems of incompetence, protective for human capital. Over the next week, clients began to speak in private. Some made little noises like, "We're reviewing options." A few big ones disclosed they were pausing renewal talks pending clarity. That dagger drove Optima's stock down another notch. The press turned from question to narrative. Leadership question marks, investor concern. Richard's speeches started sounding rehearsed in a way that revealed the rehearsing. On the board, divisions showed in private. Some directors, long accustomed to Richard's gloss, began to insist on answers. They asked hard questions about succession, governance, and why they had let an inexperienced VP step into a role that mattered so much. The chairman, who had once deferred to Richard's charisma, expressed the kind of worry that can't be sounded over drinks and has to be voiced in a boardroom. Preston had, in a single week, transitioned from the man of the moment to the man under the microscope. People who had been polite to him at dinners became blunt in private messages. That is how power works. It is not only who you are, it's who you can keep in the room. He could not. The failure is contagious. A pivotal moment came when a large custodian, one that processes a great deal of institutional flows, publicized a temporary hold on certain transfers pending client confirmation. That is the kind of administrative move that looks small but has outsized consequences. Payments delayed, fee schedules shifted, vendor relationships redrawn. The market hates uncertainty. It sells in droves. On a rainy Thursday, Optima called an emergency board meeting. I watched the ticker slide down as people made calls, processed documents, and, most importantly, forced the leadership team to confront a basic reality. They had miscalculated what loyalty actually represented. Richard had cultivated a comfortable version of influence that relied on speeches, not the daily, persistent, trust-building conversations that make clients stick. He had underestimated the human capital his company actually ran on. At that meeting, quietly and without fanfare, several board members asked the chairman to consider a leadership change. They didn't like the idea of being dragged through a public fight that might cost them millions and reputations. Leadership is often a social contract. When that contract frays, markets respond. A week later, with the stock languishing and a series of angry investor letters piling up, the board announced an independent review. Richard was asked to take a leave during the inquiry.
Preston was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. The company described this, predictably, as a move to stabilize operations. It read more like an admission that their earlier purge had been hasty and that their talent assessment had been shallow. Watching a CEO who once spoke in comfortable anecdotes step down is not intoxicating, it is corrective. The market took note, and with the leadership vacated, institutional investors began to negotiate more openly. Arthur, having seen the company's willingness to threaten and then fail to produce foundational documents, began to instruct his team to reassess the allocation. He moved an initial tranche, sized and staged, into a managed account earmarked for client continuity at Apex. That money was not a bribe, it was a tool to stabilize the work that mattered. It was in the settling that I felt the real scale of what we'd done.
We had not burned the company to make a point. We had exposed bad governance and then created an alternative that tried to preserve value. I hired Chloe. I wrote an offer that was honest and generous, and she accepted with a voice that trembled once and then steadied. She came to Apex as a member of a team I would manage. I brought with her a few other analysts I could vouch for, people who had done the real work and deserved continuity. We onboarded them with care. That was the moral spine of the whole episode: protect the people who do the work. There were costs. A few support staff at Optima lost their positions. I saw the names in the HR notices and felt a hollow ache. I arranged consulting support for those I could find and put a small fund in place to help with job placement for a handful of people I had worked with closely. It wasn't charity, it was responsibility. We took on a few contractors who needed bridge income and connected others to recruiters. None of that undoes the pain, but it reduces it. The legal threats faded as the evidence we had, public filings, client calls, and missing executed contracts, made the prospect of a win for Optima less certain. Courts don't like to issue sweeping orders when the attachments are ambiguous. Gerald's theater was effective for a while, but theater doesn't win at deposition if the props are flimsy. Months later, the independent review recommended changes in governance, better HR practices, and, crucially, a more rigorous process for promotions, especially those that place inexperienced people in high-impact roles. The board issued a statement acknowledging failings. Richard resigned formally. Preston, whose ambitions had been the fulcrum of the week's drama, pivoted into an uncertain career path, the kind of consequence he had never imagined. It was, in other words, real accountability. A friend asked me, after the dust settled, whether I felt any guilt. I told her the truth. I felt a complex relief. There is a kind of ethical ambiguity in using leverage to shift money, but there is also a moral clarity in preserving human work. I did not take pleasure in another person's misfortunes. I took solace in making space for a better functioning organization and in protecting the people who had been vulnerable. The city skyline looked the same that summer. My life was different, less the comfortable rhythm of a long tenure and more a series of addressed priorities. I built a small team at Apex, one that valued competence over charisma and conversation over spin. We spent mornings returning calls and evenings drafting plans that were as much about people as spreadsheets. The money Arthur moved came with conditions and audits, and we delivered. The clients we brought over didn't come because of a press release, they came because someone answered their calls when they mattered. There are critics of what I did, people who call it ruthless. Some colleagues from my old world whispered that I exploited a lapse. I accept that. To some, the moral calculus will always tilt in different directions. But there is a difference between exploiting a gap in procedure and willfully destroying a company for sport. I chose the former. I converted trust into a resource for continuity, not for spectacle. There is a lesson in governance here. Boards that prioritize optics over the boring labor of relationship maintenance put their companies at risk. Talent is not a line item. It is an accumulation of small pledges.
You return calls. You fix messy reconciliations at 2 a.m. You remember the details that make clients feel seen. Leadership that confuses applause for loyalty finds itself one bad quarter away from ruin. I want to be utterly clear on something critical. Nothing I did relied on illegal acts. There is a persistent myth that corporate revenge stories are built on dramatic breaches, deleted files, midnight hacks, stolen servers. That is not how the world I live in works. We relied on relationships, timing, and legal counsel. We let paperwork and investor discipline do the rest. When the opposition tried to weaponize threats, counsel pointed out the limits of their posture. That legal reality is a part of the architecture here. It is not a loophole to be exploited by anyone, anywhere. It was instead the terrain we had to navigate, because others had been sloppy with their paperwork and hubris. The title they tried to pin on me, unprofessional, has a particular flavor in boardrooms. It is a code word. Use it when you want to remove someone messy, inconvenient, or who asks too many uncomfortable questions. I own my version of unprofessionalism. I insisted on competence. I refused to normalize spin, and I treated the work and the people who do it as worthy of protection. If that's unprofessional, fine. I let the word sit like a badge of an era that rewards performance over polish. Months after the headlines quieted, I walked into a conference room and saw a familiar face, Chloe, presenting a client update with assurance and clarity. She had grown. So had the team. We had created a culture where messy, hard things were acknowledged and worked through. We celebrated small wins, a client who renewed, a junior hire who got promoted, an analyst who found a role in a place that respected the hours she put in. Richard's departure had an obvious market effect. Optimus stock tumbled and then stabilized under new leadership, but it never fully recovered its earlier shine. The company restructured. Some investors left. Some stayed. The market is a pendulum. For some, it's a cautionary tale. For others, it's an instruction manual on the perils of substituting charm for capability. And me? I moved through the city feeling stranger and more grounded both. Power is often thought of as a thing you have, like a remote control. But power is the capacity to convene people who will do consequential work together. It is less sexy than headlines. It is more sustainable. I had been fired for being unprofessional, reclaimed capital by converting trust into stable allocations, and in doing so, exposed a leadership that preferred spectacle to stewardship. That, in public, weakened the CEO's hand and unmoored a narrative he had used to hold power. There's a subtlety I want to leave you with. I didn't break Richard for sport. The board removed him because he had failed to value the human currency that undergirds business. When someone in power uses a firing as theater rather than a fix, they cut the ropes that tie markets and people together. In that sense, what happened was inevitable once the scaffolding was tested. I provided a credible alternative, anchored by capital that had to be cautious and counsel that kept us honest. If this story has a moral, it is not revenge in the lurid sense. It is about agency, the possibility of turning an unfair moment into a chance to protect people and preserve work. It is about the fragility of spectacle and the steady, slippery power of relationships. And it is about the ethical responsibility leaders have to the people who do the daily work of a company. A week from now, someone else will make the same mistake another company once made, and someone else will have to decide whether to be a loud hand-wringer or a pragmatic guardian. I choose the latter. If you want more stories where messy corporate theater meets the private mechanics of power and honest reflections on what it takes to win without being cruel, subscribe. I'll tell you what I learned so you can judge for yourself whether being called unprofessional might sometimes mean being professional enough to change things.